And then um, now, of course, they were not saying in the video that like that you you don't die and go to heaven. It's just that sorry, let me view slideshow. It wasn't about like the if you look at the verses about dying and going to heaven, they are there. Being with Christ is a real thing. And when we do lose loved ones or when we do die, we are with Jesus. Um, it's just that there's not many verses about that. Some of those verses, when you take that model in your head about like that's it, then you bring those to those verses, you sometimes get that impression. But if you look at the overall picture, you realize that what you're talking about most of the time is like that's something for the in between. It's not the end of the story. So uh it's one of those things, like what N.T. Wright like calls it, that's the in-between bit. A lot of, it's not, a lot of people understand that there's life after death, but there's life after death. And that's what the overall biblical story is really all about. And it brings you back to what man was created for in the first place. We're going to get into all of these things. So we've got like this whole idea about heaven and earth. And, you've got all this kind of art about it and, things to kind of describe it. And really it's a thing that we know what earth is and we understand, like what nature is and all that. But what in the world is heaven, because most of the pictures that we have are from the sky, and we have this idea of about heaven up there and earth down here, and those are truths. But it's almost kind of like even in the Bible you discover that those pictures are kind of a symbol for a reality, because what heaven isn't something that you can find in nature. You can't go up and find heaven. I mean, you can find outer space, you can find you can go out of our atmosphere or up in the sky or up in the clouds, and it's not exactly what you understand as being heaven. So whatever art we have, you have artful depictions of this, but even in the art for the artist, they know that like, well, it's a thing that we can kind of imagine in a way, but nothing that we can really put our finger on. And the biblical writers are very, very aware of this. So if I say heaven, you say, and most people will say hell, right? It's heaven, and then complete this phrase, heaven and most people will say hell. I did a search for this in Blue Letter Bible. I found one hit. There was no exact hits for this. And in fact, the term heaven and hell together as a phrase appears nowhere in the Bible. This is from the KJV, and this is the only version where I even found the words heaven and hell in the same sentence. But most translations have this, Hades. So and thou, Capernaum, which are exalted unto heaven, shall be brought down to the grave, or down to Hades. For if the mighty works have been done in thee, had been done in Sodom, it would have remained to this day. So, of course, the Bible talks plenty about hell or Hades or Sheol or Gehenna. But as far as a pairing goes, the pairing for heaven is earth. So if a search for heaven and earth here occurred 690 times, and 143 verses had the exact same phrase, heaven and earth. So there were like it's a thing that shows up over and over and over. The Bible is a story about heaven and earth. It's less of a story about heaven and hell. We talk about heaven and hell. The Bible talks about heaven and earth predominantly. So, and it's not that earth is the opposite of heaven. It is a it is opposite in a way, but it's the heaven and earth are kind of a pair, like that go together. So it's a counterpart, but it's also, heaven and earth from the video you see is kind of meant to overlap and intertwine. There's a relationship between the two, and it's a relationship that's damaged, but the story of the Bible is how it becomes repaired and undamaged, and not about how now there's a rift and what God had to do is come up with plan B and just get rid of earth. That's not a story in the Bible. So this is kind of like what we have, like when we talk about our cosmology, we think of, like, we can get a picture sometimes, in the modern day where we've actually sent the satellites and people up into space, and we've seen the earth from, very far away, and we've seen it hanging around in the heavens, or in this, in the middle of space, somewhere. And so we have this cosmology in our mind, and sometimes, we think of, like, well, where's heaven? Is it outside of the universe? Is it part of the universe? Is it in the sky? We usually don't think of it in terms of like it's in our atmosphere or anything like that. For the ancients, this is a little bit more like a, a, um, a, a cosmology that they had in their mind. Because you're talking not about a globe, but the circle of the earth, and you had the foundations, and the waters below and the waters above, and a firmament, and then, like in the heaven of heavens, on top of all that, you would have you know God's throne and his heavenly space, and that, that somehow it's transferable to earth or something like that. If you look in old, well, not even old Bibles, but like if you look at biblical cosmology diagrams that people have done in all kinds of like study books, and I remember, yeah, I've got like these kind of diagrams in a lot of like Bible handbooks and stuff like that. It's you've got Sheol underneath the earth and the columns of the earth. You have the firmament and the floodgates, the waters above the firmament. They pictured the sun and the stars as being inside the firmament, columns of the mountains. You hear a lot of this language, especially like in Job, when he describes things, and it's also poetic. So it's like, if you asked an ancient, do you think that this is the way that cosmology is made? Probably, they would think so, but what they thought of heaven might be a little bit different than, like heaven is out here somewhere. There was, you find out a little bit later that, they've got a little bit more sophistication than just thinking that heaven is somewhere inside of this cosmological picture. And by the way, this kind of picture here is similar to like what, like the Egyptians would have thought, or what the Babylonians would have thought, a little bit different. So there's no adequate way to describe heaven, and the biblical writers know this. Okay. So, as we'll discover, the idea of heaven, which is God's space, is not fully tied to the sky, etc. So biblical cosmology, and I got this wording from Evan, like, how would you describe that? But he said, it's the framework for communicating the ideas about heaven. If you're not talking about a physical reality, that you can look at it in nature and say this is what heaven is, because we then you have to have a beginning point for understanding something. And so for us, maybe, I don't think that the description of what heaven is would have been that much different. Maybe it would have used more, like, in the Bible Project, they were saying, think of like God's space as another dimension. Well, dimensions are things that we understand in modern cosmology, and like, from quantum physics, and just, like the 3 dimension, the 4th dimension being time, but then heaven being in an even separate dimension. But it's probably not even connected to anything physical at all, because those things are all part of a physical universe, where heaven doesn't have to be any part of a physical universe. So you can describe it in those kinds of ways, but it's not. But you're still you're still having to use pictures of what we have on earth, right? So the point of saying that heaven is God's space is that it's not in or part of the physical universe, no matter what your cosmology says. So how are we supposed to talk about heaven? In a way, you're stuck using the things in the physical universe to use as an analogy to describe what God's space is. So, and you see, I mean, we've ended up with like ridiculous portrayals of heaven, which, cherubim are, as described in the Bible, are nothing like that. And, like if like in the clouds and you got flowers there and stuff like that, so through the ages, we've come up with like some bizarre ideas about like what heaven would. By the way, angels don't have wings. Cherubs do, but they don't look like babies. Um, I kind of Googled like paintings of heaven or pictures of heaven, and a lot this kind of thing came up a lot, where you have like a stairway to heaven, and like a bright light in the sky, and you've got clouds, and it's I think it's kind of, this one's kind of cool in that like you can tell it's not supposed to be clouds in our atmosphere, but clouds somewhere, but it's not in um, you know. And then of course, what is this? Maybe Jacob's ladder or something? Yeah, right, And Jacob's ladder, by the way, we're gonna talk about that today. And it's kind of important. So God's space and our space, they describe heaven and earth as being, two different kinds of spaces, but they can overlap. They can be both in the same place at the same time. And so let's talk about Jacob's ladder. So here you have sort of like one of the early scenes in the Bible where Jacob has this dream and he sees a depiction of a stairway to heaven, angels. On this picture, it's got wings. They've got wings too, which always drives me nuts, kind of. But they're going up and down, and so here already you get like this picture that God's presence is there, and that in a way He's experienced heaven as being right there and not a million miles away, or not even as far, so it's kind of like he's seeing a depiction of something, and what he says, well, we'll read this part in Genesis. He says, and he dreamed, and behold, there was a ladder set up on earth, and the top of it reached to heaven, and behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac. And he says a whole, skipping down to verse 15, says, behold, I am with you, and I will keep you wherever you go. So he's just letting them know, I'm right here, and I'm with you. Okay, the presence of God is with Jacob, and I will bring you back to this land. So here you've already got this idea that like God is in, like in the promised land, and he's saying, I'm going to bring you back to this promised land, and it's an indication that I am going to be present in this land. This is where I am. This is where you need to be, right? For I will not leave you until I have done what I've promised you. Then Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. And he was afraid, and he said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. So he's seeing, Shiloh as being sort of a spot where heaven and earth meet or overlap, or there's a door there for it, or something. Now, what Jesus does with this is pretty interesting, because what he does in John 1, it says Jesus saw Nathanael. Now, Nathanael was the one who was he was, can anything good come from Nazareth? And so I think Philip brings him to meet Jesus for the first time. And so Jesus saw Nathanael coming towards him and said of him, behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom there is no deceit. Nathanael said to him, how do you know me? It's like, you seem to know something about me, And Jesus answered him, before Philip called you, when you were under the fig tree, I saw you. Nathanael answered him, Rabbi, you are the Son of God. Nathanael, there's something where Nathanael knows this Jesus saw something that only I would know about. I like the way that the Bible, what do you call it, the Chosen portrayed this whole story, and that's pretty cool. Anyway, so Nathanael answered him, said, Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel. Jesus answered him, because I said to you, I saw you under the fig tree. You do you believe? You haven't seen anything yet, Nathanael, basically. You will see greater things than these. And he said to him, truly, truly, I say to you, you will see heaven opened and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man. He's using the picture of something, of course, Nathanael is going to be very familiar with, and that would be Jacob's ladder scene, right? In other words, God is in this place. Let me see. So this is none other than the house of God. Think about that. That's what Jacob had to say about it. Jesus is saying, I am the house of God. In other words, I am the temple. And this is the gate of heaven. Jesus is the way to heaven. So for Jesus, it's not a geographical site. For him, it's a person. He's like, I am the way, the truth, and the life. So he's saying, I am where heaven and earth overlap. I am where the presence of God is. That's what he starts saying about himself. So here you've already seen that, again, kind of like if you have too much of a cosmological vision about heaven, something, and it doesn't work here. And you can already see that they're thinking. There's been a lot of thinking in the meantime, and now what Jesus is saying is that everything you've started to ponder about what the temple is and what the tabernacle is and what these places are and where God appears, in Sinai and everything, it's all it's in me. So you have this idea kind of like of hotspots of heaven on earth. Hotspots, I'm kind of ripping Bible Project off of that because they call the Holy of Holies a hotspot. But so many times in scripture, we see God's face as being on earth. You see this at Shiloh, with Jacob's ladder. You see this on Mount Sinai when Moses goes up there. You see it in the tabernacle. You see the temple, etc. But it's obvious that the Bible writers aren't stuck on the idea that heaven is up there. Okay? It's not the way that they're thinking about it. Shiloh, Mount Sinai, the temple, the tabernacle, all these things, they're just microcosms of what the Garden of Eden was in the first place. Because the way that the Garden of Eden is portrayed and the way that you have Garden of Eden imagery at all of these places, really, especially in the temple, tabernacle, Mount Sinai, every time somebody has a vision of being in the throne room, there you have the cherubim. And there was cherubim at the garden. They're like guardian. They're bouncers, right? It's kind of like you don't get any closer to the throne. You're not going into this garden. It's kind of like the cherubim were those things like reappear over and over. But you see this at the Garden of Eden. Before the cherubim, I should say. You didn't have to have throne guardians when God and man were in unity and working together. So those are all kind of microcosms, and it's kind of a promise that this is going to happen again. Eden will happen again, and not just Eden, but what Eden would have developed into, right? So Eden was where man's space and God's space were intertwined and overlapping. And Eden is the new heavens and the new earth is where that ultimately is going to get fulfilled at. So you have this idea of being fully united. This could be a picture of Eden. this could also be a picture of the new heavens, new earth. And again, though, angels that have wings, which they don't. I, I love driving that home. So these overlaps are what Eden and the new heavens are all about. The garden was a spot that was supposed to spread, and it will. So I kind of like the way that they introduced it in the video was that once heaven and earth were fully united, not in my opinion, I don't think so. I think it was a bit more like in the garden that was a special place, and man was there, and part of what they needed to do was fill the earth, and as they fill the earth, God's presence was going to be in all the earth. Now we know that God is omnipresent anyway, but I'm talking about the heaven reality of being united with earth. So, yeah, right. So I don't know. I question whether it was like a full, but I think that they, on in their defense, the way that the Genesis 1 description is the way that you would build a temple. So so in Genesis 1, you do have a description. If you look at the way that Solomon built the temple, it was in a certain order and in 7 stages. And this was also common, with like pagans and stuff. And you would put the idol for them, in the middle of it, and what we would call the Holy of Holies. And there's the mouth opening ceremony and all these kinds of things. We found all these transcripts in Ugarit, or tablets, I should say. And then when you look at Genesis 1, there is a description of like, it seems that God, built a temple for himself, which was the cosmos. So maybe it was all, one big place. I don't know. I always pictured the garden as being kind of like the place where all this would spread to. And then, but God has promised that surely as I live, the earth will be filled with my glory. And for him, that's a thing that still is going to happen. Now, if the earth is going to be filled with his glory, that means he's not getting rid of it. Right. So it's like, why would you get rid of something, fill it with your glory and then get rid of it, or get rid of it and then fill it with your glory, which doesn't make sense. So no, it's about the restoration of heaven and earth together. So the way I would describe it is that new heavens and new earth is the trajectory of where Eden was going. It's Eden fulfilled. And Adam and Eve were to be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth. They would spread God's glory throughout creation. But the fall took us on what I would call a long detour. What we are is we took a detour, and the question was, how is this going to get fixed? But it's resolved through Christ, because of what Christ did. That is the sign to us that this is taken care of, and we can have our faith in what Christ did and in him, that we're looking forward to the redemption of our bodies, and we're looking for the redemption of earth. So Christ, he's the new Adam, and God is redeeming the earth through the new humanity, which is Christ and the rest of us who are in Christ. So God's space versus our space. If you look here, you have his presence, goodness, justice, beauty. You have sin, injustice, and ugliness. Of course, it wasn't always like this. This is the only reason that these are not overlapping and intertwined the way that they should be, is because, we were put in charge of the earth. And this is going to bring us to what man was created for in the first place, was to rule this, right? We're to rule this. And when we ruled this outside of God's guidance and decided on our own, this is the result. We can't reign with him. Christ is begun to reign in heaven, and all authority has been given to him. where he reigns over all heaven and all earth. In Revelation, the title deed of the earth is being held up, and John, who's in heaven, starts crying convulsively because nobody's worthy to take this, and to even look on it. But the lamb who'd been slain, he was able to take it and open it. So this is a thing that's been resolved, so yeah, we have two spaces because of this. Now, man was created to stand at the threshold of both of these places because he is part earth creature, but he's also part heaven creature. He's made out of the dust of the earth, but he's put in the garden and he's given the breath of life. So he is the representative of creation before God, and he's the representative of God being made in God's image to the rest of creation. We're kings and priests. Kings being the ones who rule over the earth on God's behalf, and priests being the ones who sum up all of creation's praises and blessings before God. So that's that's the idea that we're going to talk more about priests and kings in this. The temple. So the temple is kind of like that's has become, because you had a temple and it was understood to be the place. Now, again, you're talking about a physical building, right? We would make a physical structure. But at the same time, when man was in rebellion, the people who ran the temple were in rebellion, the temple keepers and the people to whom the temple had been given and everything. God's presence left the temple at some point, and at one point never came back. Or I should say, in Ezekiel's day, God's presence left and it never came back. It actually went to Babylon, which is even more interesting. He was with his people in exile. And he's still with his people in exile, but in a different way. So it's not about the structure, is it? Again, it's not about the physical reality. And when David wants to build God a house, a permanent structure, and not a tent, God is like, you can't build me a house. What are you talking about? I mean, like the heaven is, heaven is my throne, earth's my footstool. There's no way you could make a building. I built myself a house to begin with, and it's the cosmos. You can't build me. You can build me a representative house, and it'll help you understand what's going on, maybe. And so, God sanctioned the temple, and Solomon built it. But at the same time, there was such a reality about it that the sons of Korah that went in there, was it sons of Korah? Yeah, that went in there and lit strange fire to the Lord and went in there apparently drunk or whatever. They got smoked. So like the presence of God was definitely a reality there, but again, it's kind of like it's where heaven meets earth, but it's still not about a structure. So there you have like this idea of like, well, let me skip to that Jesus is that temple where he is. Like we think, well, him calling himself a tabernacle or tabernacle among us, what kind of language is that? Well, it's because we were never talking about something made out of stone, made by human hands. We've always been talking about something that was being not made by human hands. And guess what? We're part of that structure. He's the cornerstone, and we are a temple being built up stone by stone as more and more people become a part of this living temple that's not made by human hands. So the sacrifice, of course, there had to been like a clean space. Of course, Christ died once for all, so in principle, all of this is forgiven and taken care of. All of that mess is taken care of. But people still have free will. But and all of it will be redeemed back to him, except for those who just don't want any part of it. So temple and the living sacrifice. So we have a temple, but we are also part of that, So this was a depiction of, Jesus going out into the world and making, like going, what's up, and cleaning spaces and healing people and all that. But his ministry has been handed to us, and we are his body. And this is the whole bringing and living Jesus to a dying world idea, that we are going into the dying world, because we're rescuing people from the earth to bring them to heaven. And so that by the time the earth gets destroyed, then no, that's not the story. It's a redeeming process of the earth. And it brings it to the point where you want to see the earth redeemed. And even the earth is described, or all of creation is described as being in birth pangs, waiting for the sons of God to be revealed, because all of creation wants this to happen. It doesn't want to be under the curse anymore. And so we want justice on the earth. All these psalms are about like, God come and judge the earth, because the earth can't be set right until God judges it. So even the judgment fits into this story a lot more clearly than God just judging people and getting rid of the earth. It's like the earth needs justice to happen in order for it to be redeemed. So some things that we're going to end up covering here, first of all, the bodily resurrection, and the redeemed creation, which is the bodily resurrection really is just a part of the redeemed creation. When we get resurrected, it means that the creation is soon to follow, or is going to be redeemed at that same time, or that process at least is going to start at that time. We'll talk a little bit more about temple. Also, what is home? There are some verses where, like if you come to a place where, our citizenship is in heaven, but then you read the rest of the verse, and it's from it we await a savior, the redemption of our bodies. There's parts of it that once you have the new creation idea in your head, then it sounds different. You interpret it differently, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, kind of poorly, but Colossians. I'm not really sure. I put it in one of the slides in the other. I think the other one that I was going to do today. And what we're going to get there soon, but we're going to cover some verses where it's kind of like, well, I got questions about this one, but how do we read it now? But first, I want to kind of like build up like the paradigm in our hearts, kind of like where we get more of a grasp, because it kind of on this, because it takes time sometimes, to think of what is home, and why would because to Paul, he was already in heaven, or we're already seated in heavenly places, or ruling with Christ. And Jesus says, so there are some things about, it's better for me to be with Christ and to die and all that. But he's not saying that and abandon this earth forever. It's like, it is a thing for it in the interim. So there is, and I kind of put it down here, the earth versus this world. Okay, this world has more to do with an age. In other words, it's the age of sin and death. It's an age of the fall and the curse and all that. But when you get to past that age, after the earth has been judged, and after and the new creation has begun, that is a new beginning and a new time. So when you read verses about, and he will wipe away all their tears, it's not about a place, it's about a time, because the former things have been forgotten. Keyword there is former things. It's not about like, and they got to heaven and all their tears were wiped away. In fact, John is in heaven weeping convulsively, right? And you have the souls of those who have been beheaded for the cause of Christ showing up under the altar, saying, well, "How long, O Lord? How long?" Like they've got a lament. They're waiting for the earth to be judged. It's not like like, oh, this is all over now, right? So that's it's one of those little minor things. But so we'll also talk a little bit about biblical resurrection and how it contradicts kind of Greek philosophy. And really, and I kind of like wanted to study a little bit more about this, but like how we ended up with the Greek model and kind of dragged it into Christianity a little bit. So where do I go when I die? I think that one's pretty simple, really. It's like, yeah, you die, you go to be with the Lord, but you're coming back with him too. Heaven as the ruling space. So I think we think of heaven as an abode and a permanent abode, but every time heaven is depicted, and I can't think of any real exception to this, is that there's God's throne and some kind of meetings taking place, and it seems like a ruling space. Well, it is a ruling space. It's the place where decisions are made. Mm-hmm. But a lot of those decisions are about earth. So every time you see it, it's like God saying, "Do this. I've called you." You have Isaiah having Isaiah's vision is interesting, okay, because Isaiah, he has this dream where he's in the temple, right? And he sees God's throne and the cherubim. So now you've got like, wait, this is a heaven on earth scene for sure, right? Because you got the whole heaven scenario, but they're in the temple. So it's kind of like, well, this is kind of like, are you in the heavenly temple or are you in the earthly temple? And the answer is yes. Okay. But there's a meeting going on and some ruling going on, and there's a discussion, who's going to go for us? And Isaiah's, I'm here, I'll go. It's a divine council meeting. And that is what prophecy is often. Well, I think it's always like that, in the Old Testament, is you were part of a divine council meeting and now you were sent out from that meeting. When you have, there's a discussion about, like in Zechariah, about like a priest who's got dirty clothes, and the accusers, they're saying he should, this and this should happen to him, and then Michael says, the Lord rebuke you, and or somebody says, Lord rebuke you, but it's the same thing as like in Jude when it mentions, when they were contending over the body of Moses, and the archangel Michael said, like the Lord rebuke you. That is a scene that, in between the lines and understanding Zechariah, you know that was in a divine council meeting. There was some argumentation going on there, and the accuser used to be there, under, like with Job, like coming and accusing Job of stuff. But of course, we see that that's not the case anymore because of Christ's ministry, because the accuser of our brethren has been thrown down. You see that in Revelation 12. But heaven is the ruling space. It's not. So like, what's it mean that, like, where in my Father's house there are many mansions? Well, it's the same word as the word rooms, and it's the same word that they would use at the temple where there were many rooms. The priests would come there and they would they would put their stuff there when it was their tour of duty in the temple or whatever. So there's a bit of a different idea about what heaven is, and what and rather than, like, this is your destination as a home. It's like you're part of the it's like you're part of the Senate, or like there's a it's the ruling space. You're part of the I don't know, like what do we have as an analogy? The parliaments, or where the decisions are being made. It's yeah, you're there and you're with Christ and you're ruling with him, and that's kind of like the function of all of that. But it's not the same thing as what we think of, like, well, uh, here you go and now this is your new home. It's you are home there because you belong there, but it's like, no, home is still like, there's nothing, like I said, there's nothing like a homecoming as when you come back with Christ.
No, like the Bible concept, showing the circle.
Yeah, right. Yeah, right. Yeah. Yeah, there is more than just the ruling space, yeah. But we kind of like but the depictions we have of heaven is largely a ruling space. It's kind of like, but even I think God wants to be with us in on earth and enjoy his creation along with his co-rulers, you know. Yeah, I think that's a little bit, God likes creation. He likes the things that it's made. He doesn't like what it turned into for now, but he is going to redeem it. So
that's probably why I feel it more when I get out in nature, even if it's in a park.
uh-huh.
If I'm in a city where everything's all concrete, this place is like dead.
Uh-huh.
But if I go for a walk in the park, like God's been really good to me because of the hot and he'll bring a breeze.
Hmm.
Just and I think is he just doing this for me?
Hmm.
And it's possible, but it's weird. I've been out in the deserts where there's been nobody, and there'll be like and this last time I was there was like a light rain. It was so beautiful, and there was like nobody around. Then when I got quiet and calm, all these little birds around, and the little birds were doing little bird dances and just strange stuff. But it was like so cool.
Mm.
It just, but you will never see that really here. You see little bits of it,
Right.
but when you get out where he's at, away from all the nonsense,
Hmm.
no radio, no internet, no nothing. It's just so much better.
Yeah. And then we're also going to talk about man because it defines who we are. We don't really get a full definition of what man is if you're ditching Earth in the picture. Because what was man created for in the first place? To rule the earth. And to stand with one foot in heaven, one foot on earth, and rule on God's behalf and be God's creation, hanging out with him, on the other on the other hand. So that's kind of our intro. Next time we'll get a little bit more into uh, um, the resurrection. And there's more than one way that there's more than one dimension to resurrection because we are already resurrected, but there's a physical resurrection coming. So anyway, so got any thoughts there, anybody? Or I'm going to stop recording here.